So good afternoon, Chris. It's a great honor to have you speak to the attendees at UC Irvine Center for Digital Transformation annual conference. Tell us a little bit about your path to your appointment as National Cyber Director. I believe you're the first National Cyber Director. And what does your job entail?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I know we all wish we could be face-to-face. It's hard to root out a million years of human evolution, which craves for the face-to-face. But it is, I think, the miracle of the age that we can use digital infrastructure, cyberspace, to do just this. My path to this particular job, as in most things, was somewhat serendipitous. I think I've been working cyber issues for 45 years, though for most of that time, I didn't know that. I was in the telecommunications sector, working for NSA in my early days, trying to build and sustain secure systems. I think we ultimately discovered, like everyone else, that the best you can do is to build and sustain defensible systems. And I'll speak to that in our kind of talk today, but there's a material difference between those two. I've spent some time in the private sector on various public boards that were kind of critically dependent upon digital infrastructure. Spent some time at the Naval Academy teaching computer science, teaching cyber science. And more recently, before I came into this job, I was on something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Essentially, by law, I think it was the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019, tasked a group of 8 people to consider and recommend strategy for the nation to put cyber in its proper place. And I'll speak to what the outtakes of that were. One of those recommendations was to create this position which named the National Cyber Director, which would be presidentially nominated, Senate confirmed, live in the White House, and essentially drive coherence across the federal ecosystem, drive public-private collaboration, and not so much be a vertical where you direct the actions of various and sundry organizations in this space, but recognizing that cyber largely is a horizontal, where all of these occur side by side by side. My job is to add value to that.
Well, let's begin by talking about this cyber landscape. How do you describe the threat vectors today?
I'm going to come at that somewhat obliquely, but I'll answer in main point the direct question that you've asked. I'd like to start with the title of your organization. It's the UC Irvine Center for Digital Transformation. That title, I think, actually is correctly framed. It says a lot about how we should think about this space. It does not start with a consideration of the threat. It does not start with a consideration of the frailties of the digital infrastructure within which our digital transformation, our digital lives live. It starts with a positive characterization of what our aspirations should be. That's where I'd like to start. I'd like to start with an obsession on what I want cyber to do for me, or what I want to do with and through cyber. It's an infrastructure on which activities of a personal nature, business nature, critical functions, national security nature, all of those take place on that digital infrastructure. If we see it that way, then I think more of us, more beyond those who have the word cyber or IT in their job titles, more of us would then say, well, we care about it. We care about what it does. We care about how it's built. We care about whether it's appropriately resilient and robust, if we in fact subordinate it to our larger interest. So my job, first and foremost, alongside UC Irvine, is to try to be a thought leader to put cyber in its proper place, subordinate it to our larger interest. If we in fact succeed in that, if we mobilize a larger cadre of people to care about cyber, because cyber doesn't exist for its own sake, rather to deliver the things dependent on it, then our next task is to figure out what investments are we willing and prepared to make in it so that it meets our needs, so that it delivers on that confidence. I would say that resilience by design is the term of art that I use in that kind of category of discussion. And I mean by saying that, we don't have to invest in the technology to get it right. More importantly, we have to invest in the roles and responsibilities. We have to invest in the people skills to get it right. Technology will then follow. Let me give 2 very specific examples. Most of the audience on this discussion probably is aware, at least in the kind of dim recesses of your reading of the newspapers, about 2 things that happened in the last year and a half that were causes celeb. One was a SolarWinds attack.
Right.
It was in fact a Russian nation-state attack on a kind of software company that lives in Texas that deploys software that essentially categorizes and summarizes the state of play in your local digital infrastructure. What do you have? Is it up to speed? Is it performing as you would have expected? That attack was not predicated by some technology flaw, though at the end of the day, it was largely implemented using a software hack. It was predicated based upon a doctrinal failure. At the end of the day, nobody was defending that supply chain. SolarWinds didn't take responsibility for the security of that software. No one down the supply chain that was adding value to it as it was sold and resold. No one down that chain added value to it. The end user assumed that someone upstream had essentially accounted for the security in that space. So the Russians didn't need to expend some technology investment that they may or may not have made. They simply walked through the open front door. That's a doctrinal failure. And if we're to be resilient and robust in the future, we've got to get the roles and responsibilities right. Who is responsible for what? In the same way that when you buy a car, you don't need to independently, as a matter of an aftermarket addition, add an air safety bag or a seatbelt, or for that matter, brakes. Those are all built in. There's an expectation the suppliers, the integrators, don't simply deliver something that has a primary function, the visible function of transportation, but implicit in that is the resilience and robustness that goes hand in glove with that. More recently, we kind of suffered something called the Colonial Pipeline attack here on the East Coast. That was a criminal gang operating out of Russia. What they did was they found a single individual who had failed to do their job, failed to configure a virtual private network, term of art in cyberspace. It's actually a technical mechanism in cyberspace. And that single failure they took advantage of, and they then ultimately held at risk the confidence of millions of Americans up and down the Eastern Seaboard. Again, 85% of what goes wrong in cyberspace is attributable to not getting the roles and responsibilities right, not having the people skills right. So that long story made short, if we believe cyber has a critical role to play in the things we care about in our daily lives, then resilience by design means that we invest in roles and responsibilities, we invest in people skills, and of course, we invest in technology. The only other thing I'll say, and then let you get perhaps kind of to another question, drive us into the corner of discussion you'd prefer, is that what results if you make those investments is a defensible architecture. Back to my opening remarks. I learned at NSA that there's no such thing as a secure system. At best, these systems are defensible. In the same way that there's no perfectly safe transit across a modern city or perfectly safe transit across a highway system. There is inherent risk in any and all of that. It's manageable risk, it's reasonable risk, but you must participate in the defense of a defensible system. Others must, alongside of you, participate in the defense of a defensible system. And if we do that right, if we get the roles and responsibilities right, we'll participate in a collaboration, not a set of divisions of effort, meaning that all of us can participate in the defense of each of us. It's actually what's happening in the Ukraine at this moment in time. Against the abominable attacks that the Russians have effected, both in the physical world and the cyber world, what they find is they're up against a coalition where they have to beat many of us to beat one of us. That is especially true in cyberspace, where the Russians, in their cyber attacks, have found themselves having to beat Microsoft, ESET, Cisco, the Ukrainians, some NATO elements, United States assisting all of them, none of that being provocative, all of that being kind of couched as defense, appropriate defense against an aggressor who's the provocateur. I think if we do those two things, resilience by design and a collective collaborative defense, we can change the game. We can make defense the new offense, and we can obsess about our positive aspirations as opposed to getting up in the morning and obsessing about threats.
How do we build sort of these organizations with better architectures that can then also partner with the government, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. I kind of believe in the old saw, which that form should follow function. And so first and foremost, as an organization that intends to succeed in its use of digital infrastructure, call it the internet, call it cyberspace, or anything else in between, it needs to first come to grips, come to an understanding of what its expectations are of digital infrastructure. Do they know what resources kind of are stored in cyberspace? Do they know what functions kind of exist and ride across cyberspace? If they don't know that, then they can't possibly have any reasonable expectations that it will deliver on those expectations. Many companies don't answer those questions up front. In the case of the Colonial Pipeline, that second example that I talked about, part of the problem there was that the company that was managing that pipeline did not know whether their administrative system, what's typically called the information technology system, was connected to their operational system where the pipes, the valves, the motors live. And not knowing whether those two were connected, not having an understanding about what their reliance was, what their critical reliance was, when they became aware that there was a transgressor, a Russian criminal gang inside the administrative side, they really had no choice but to shut down the whole thing, because the worst case would have been that they would then transgress, move into the operational side. That's a company which I'm sure has kind of remediated that, but that's a company at the time that had not thought about that in advance. And so when organizational design they might have undertaken, whatever architecture that they might have chosen, would have stood on a very unfirm foundation, because they themselves didn't know up front what the role of digital infrastructure was. If that then is undertaken, get the role right, then you need to figure out who is accountable for that. Many companies where you might find the boardroom or the operations teams essentially understanding the business plan, taking risks in the extension of that plan, understanding how to project that business across digital infrastructure into new markets, to new spaces, physically and virtually, but not having a full and fair understanding about what the IT threats or the operational technology threats are in those new spaces. What then happens in some of those situations is that when that team takes those risks, again, kind of on the ops side of an organization, you find that the folks who essentially are deploying the literal digital infrastructure, they discover those risks as those risks are being undertaken. They don't actually have an opportunity to come into the boardroom and to say, let's actually consider those before we take those risks. Let's address those and mitigate those before we take those risks. And that reconciliation in real time is really hard to do. What you need to do is to make sure that those who take risks are one and the same as those who are accountable for mitigating those risks. My bet, and I've been on some public boards before, is that any organization worth its salt would obsess about the selection of the next CEO, or for that matter, the next CTO, the next COO. You need to have the same obsession about understanding what the next role for your digital infrastructure might be. Now, most folks in that room aren't qualified to have a technical discussion down to the deck plates on what essentially the possibilities are, or for that matter, what the implementation looks like. There's no shame in that. I'm not qualified to have that exhaustive discussion. I tend to come from a policy and an ops background, not a technology background, my degrees notwithstanding. But what you then do in understanding that is you bring those people into the room and you have those discussions. Tell us kind of what our reliance on digital infrastructure is. Let's do that in the context of the business plan, not in the context of an IT plan. If you find yourself in the presence of a chief information security officer, a CISO, they tend to live on the side of the IT kind of part of the organization, and ask them, what is it that you do? If they say, I defend digital infrastructure, I defend IT, you probably have the wrong person. If they say, I defend the business plan, you're off to the races. Both sides have to get that conversation right and marry it to what the organization's business goals are or mission goals are, not what its IT goals are. We don't talk about what our HR strategy is, absent the context of what our business strategy is, what our mission strategy is. Let's treat IT the same way, cyber the same way. It doesn't exist for its own sake.
No, that's really interesting and right on sort of target with what we're trying to get across in this conference. But I think your framing is very useful. These are really business risks. How do you think about the if you were to do all of this right, we have to confront what I've heard you call the cyber poverty gap, which is a lot of the state, county, local governments, and even smaller private sector entities, they're under-resourced, and that makes us more vulnerable. So how do we strengthen this facet of our approach?
Our defense today is largely based on what I would describe as a response, or in the parlance of the business world, OpEx, operational expenditures. Right. We need to do what we've done in other domains of interest to say that that's an insane way to approach this. We don't actually defend kind of our transit through kind of transportation system, whether that's getting on an airplane or getting in a car that way. The way we do it there is that we hold the providers of those technologies and those systems, and focus on the systems as much as the discrete technologies. We hold them accountable for thinking through, how do you build a resilient, robust, kind of defensible architecture? Not just the car, but the highway system, and the kind of the activities that take place on that highway system to properly patrol it, respecting privacy, of course, respecting proprietary interest. But how do we build it so that when you buy a pound of transportation, you actually can have an expectation that it comes along with resilience and robustness built in. When you get on an airplane, somebody has attended to the resilience and robustness of the airframe, of the power plane on that airplane, of the training of the pilots on that airplane, and the system within which that airplane is going to operate. That's a system approach that says we have to think way upstream of the actual use of that architecture, of how do we build in resilience and robustness. So the commodity providers in cyberspace, I think, have a responsibility to build in reasonable kind of resilience and robustness. And you begin to see that happening. So I think inherent resilience and robustness should be expectation of every user. That being said, the best we're going to give the user is something that is defensible. It can be used in a safe and resilient way. That's no different than the way it works in our private lives. And that user must then participate in his or her own defense.
In the interest of time, I'm going to ask you two questions together. One is because you brought up Ukraine and you said if you want to go into that, if we could do that piece of it relatively quickly. And then I also, because we're a university, want to make sure we cover sort of the issue of the talent in the cyberspace world, which is, I've read there's about 700,000 open positions. Some estimates go a lot higher. How can we as a university help this country build an inclusive talent pool that sort of fills these jobs?
I think a number of us, myself included, didn't imagine that the Ukrainians would be able to withstand a numerically superior, and in some cases a technologically superior onslaught from the Russian nation state. As abominable as that attack was, we thought that it would succeed. And in the realm of cyberspace, and let me restrict my remarks to that, we've seen something quite analogous to what we've observed in physical space. The Russians by no means have succeeded as they thought they would and as we thought they might. And why is that? I think there are several factors. One, we underestimated the power of defense. We underestimated the ability of the Ukrainians to essentially kind of mount a stout defense on, to be sure, imperfect architectures. The cyber systems that they have, they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination any more than ours are. But they're perhaps kind of under constant assault and constant kind of stress and pressure, and therefore they might even be weaker than many of those that we have. And yet they have prevailed. Why is that? Because they understand those systems. They understand how to allocate their expectations to those systems. They understand how to agilely kind of move their expectations around. They've invested in redundant architecture so that when one is perhaps under stress and attack, they can move capabilities to another. They find themselves kind of participating with their suppliers, whether it's the private sector entities like Microsoft, Cisco, ESET, participating in a collaboration with them so that the resilience and robustness that is delivered as a kind of component of the service is sustained over time. That those vendors are leaning in to provide meaningful assistance in the moment, not just kind of at the moment of sale and then kind of having a caveat emptor. On the Russian side of things, turns out that offense is harder than it looks. Sucker punches are still out there. There's a thing called NotPetya from 5 years ago, attributable to the Russian nation state. I think there are still some of those out there. To be sure, if we know of them, we'll kind of remove those by patching those, but there might be another one or two out there. But mounting a campaign where you coordinate and synchronize your attacks, where you understand what the success or not of those attacks might be, and you regroup, reassess, and then redeploy, that's harder than we imagined. And the Russians have kind of shown themselves to not be terribly good at that. And so I'm very, very much encouraged going forward, their own strategy kind of being tested kind of in the real by the Ukrainians, their own strategies based on sound principles. Now, you also mentioned the people piece of cyberspace. I think that's really, really important. You mentioned that there are upwards of 700,000 jobs at the moment across the United States that have the word cyber or IT in the job title empty. Turns out that's true. The good news is that we continue to fill those jobs at a constant rate. The bad news is the denominator is running away from us. It's about 1/3 of the jobs. Last year it was about 450,000. I think it was probably a lagging indicator. It's steadily going up. We have to fill those jobs. And in so doing, we have to rethink everything about those jobs. We have to assess whether the jobs have actually been specified properly. I don't think you need a computer science degree to be a chief information security officer. You need good, solid critical thinking skills. You need the ability to live in a horizontal system where you have multiple disciplines and multiple activities. But I have met some extraordinary CISOs who majored in English or political science or history, and what they have going for them is they're good critical thinkers and they can mobilize a diverse team. So let's re-examine the jobs. That's not taking us to a lowest common denominator. That's saying, how do we appeal to the broadest population that can actually fill those jobs? We're at the moment working with a broad coalition of private sector, academic, and federal and state and local, but government leaders to actually craft a national workforce strategy for cyber. It's not going to be a vertical strategy. It'll be a horizontal strategy, which how do we actually kind of line abreast, taking advantage of all of those capabilities, all those authorities, all of that kind of ideation. And back to your kind of title, which is focused on, what are our digital aspirations, not our digital threats. If we focus with our aspirations, it will motivate us to make the right investments, kind of to mobilize the right crowd, to achieve the right end purposes, so that this once again is the very positive moment, this very propitious moment that we enjoyed in the early 1990s, when we had every reason to believe that the internet, which was emerging at that time, was going to deliver on all of these robust expectations. It still can, it still must. There's really no other choice. I appreciate the time kind of spent with you today. I know we've taken a very fast skate across some thin ice, but I think the fact that you have this on your agenda, that you're actually working your way through this, is greatly heartening to me, kind of such that we can mobilize the critical thinking of all of your audience and what lies beyond them.
Well, thank you for your time. This was a fantastic set of comments. We really appreciate your time. And more than anything else, thank you for what you're doing for cybersecurity and the government. We really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you. Good luck to us.